4. My name is Richard West, and I'm one of the editors of Source. And some of my colleagues, my co-editor John and Susanna Galbraith, are also here this evening. And I think some of our contributors are here this evening as well, so welcome everybody. We are going to talk to two of the contributors for this issue, but first of all I should show you the new issue. Here it is. Hopefully most of you who are subscribers will have received it in the post already. But first of all, I should thank the various people who've made this event possible. Of course, our funders, Belfast City Council, the Arts Council of Northern Ireland and Arts Council Ireland, and the Gallery of Photography Ireland, who are co-hosting this event with us as they did the two previous events. This will be recorded if you have to leave early or if you have missed some of it, and put on our YouTube channel, so you can watch it back, as indeed you can watch the two previous talks which were the introductions to the two previous issues of the magazine. I should say also on our YouTube channel there are quite a lot of other films. We've recently published a new film, and this morning I went to check how our YouTube channel was ticking over, and I saw that one of our first films about conceptual photography had, as of today, been viewed 50,000 times. So if you haven't seen any of those before, then you should go and have a look. And at the top of the comment section, someone had written, how do they make these films if they don't know anything? Which I think is a good platonic question that can be our guide for tonight. It's amazing the kind of inscrutable intelligence that you get in the comment section of YouTube videos. So I should mention a few other things. Obviously, we're on the cusp, hopefully, of leaving our caves and venturing out into the world. I'm certainly looking forward to it. Next week, galleries and museums will start tentatively to open their doors, and we'll be going out. If you haven't been able to get your copy of the magazine, then hopefully you can buy it in a museum or a gallery. And we would wish to continue to support our various stockists around the country. You can see a list of our stockists on our website. But if not, you can buy the magazine via our website or renew your subscription or whatever it is that's necessary to get the magazine. I should tell you a bit about it. Issue 104 is entitled Legacy, and it contains a number of interesting features. We'll be hearing from Emily Mark-FitzGerald in a moment about the colorization of photographs. There's also an interview in the feature section by April Yee, who I should mention as an aside was the winner of the Writers' Prize last year, and also as an aside that the Writers' Prize will be running again this year, and there are details in the magazine if you'd like to contribute to the magazine in future. But she has interviewed Richard Overton, the librarian at the Bodleian, about their collecting photography. There are features, portfolios by Elena Helfrecht and from the National Folklore Collection. And the third portfolio, a retrospective portfolio, is the work of Ori Gersht, including new work. And we will be talking to Ori in a few minutes. There are some excellent reviews in this issue. Sadly, we have been unable to review exhibitions because there haven't been any exhibitions. But fortunately, the book publishers have been busy, and we have a fascinating selection of books. I would draw your attention to Pippa Oldfield has done a very interesting review of a selection of World War II photo books, which is fascinating. And there's the new book by Geoffrey Batchin reviewed, and a book about the figure of Christ in contemporary photography. A number of unusual and unexpected books. Jeff Dyer's new book reviewed. Alan Sekula's new collection of essays. So much to read, much reading material. But first of all, but I should press straight on with our conversations for this evening. First of all, I'm going to talk to Emily. Emily has written a piece about the colorization of photographs. So Emily, could I ask you to unmute and then we can have a chat about that?
Sure, thanks very much. Hopefully folks can hear me. Apologies, I'm still here. Greetings from Dublin, by the way. I'm here at the university, assuming it was going to be quieter, but there seem to be some young people outside playing techno at a very loud volume. So hopefully that won't translate too much into the audio.
Yeah. I have a dreaming whippet in the corner of this room. So if there are any noises off, it could either be Dublin techno or the dreams of whippets. The colorization of photographs, when I commissioned you to write this essay, it was already a hot subject. But since we first started talking about it, it's become an even hotter subject. Maybe we could go back to the beginning. When did you first become interested in the colorization of photographs?
Yeah, it has been really actually fascinating to see it all sort of unfold. It's really been, I suppose, nearly a year since I started publicly kind of weighing in on this topic. Colorization's obviously been around for a long time. And it's something that we saw Ted Turner doing with Citizen Kane, lots of controversy around that in terms of film. We saw it come up again in terms of the Peter Jackson World War I film. But then in terms of, I suppose, it's more sort of popular prevalence, it's probably from maybe around 2018 that I really started to notice it becoming more prevalent. And I think that's probably because of two things. One is that's when one of the kind of AI-driven software, Deoldify, launched in 2018. And that was also the year that the book by Marina Amaral and Dan Jones, the kind of popular colorized history, was also published that year. And so there seems to have been obviously kind of an uptick, I think, in colorization since that time. And then here in Ireland, we have the Old Ireland in Color book that came out last year, that was a bestseller over Christmas and whatnot. So certainly colorized photos have something that have obviously begun to circulate much more widely, both in terms of print media and then online. But interestingly, perhaps not a whole lot of critique of them in terms of really, I suppose, trying to interrogate a little bit more about what's going on with photo colorization. And I'm a visual art historian. I work specifically on histories of poverty. And when I suppose my first reaction and time when I started commenting on these was when I had encountered a photograph that I've worked on in my own research, which depicts Irish eviction. And I saw a colorized version of it. And for me, that really, so I suppose, kind of hit a red button slightly because I knew that photograph so intimately. I knew its history so intimately. And I really became, quite distressed a bit with what was happening in terms of the colorization. So it's something I began to think about, I suppose, in more depth, and then have gotten into conversation with lots of folks more about it. But all of this, as you're noting, I think, Richard, has also kind of gone more into the public eye as a consequence of what's happened recently with the distorted images that were produced of the S-21 camp in Cambodia. And so that, again, has kind of kicked it into perhaps an international sort of register, these concerns around colorization and distortion of historical photographs.
Let's have a look at some of the pictures we're talking about. I have, let me see, I can't remember how to do this. You've got, you sent me a couple of pictures earlier. Screen.
I have them too, Richard, if you prefer. I don't have the permission to screen share, but I have
Sorry,
them.
I've got them here. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, so that's a set of eviction photographs. So this isn't the exact one that I saw, I suppose, that kind of triggered my initial response, but it's very similar. It's from the same collection. Right? These are images from the Lawrence collection. And these are a very famous series of lantern slides of evictions, actually, from the 1880s. And this is a series that, that I've worked on quite a bit in terms of understanding its history and how it was produced. On the right-hand side is the colorized version of that, which was colorized by John Breslin. So I suppose initially kind of seeing this image, on the right-hand side, this is something that's been processed through Deoldify, which is one of these AI-driven kind of forms of software. The thing, I may be sort of preaching to the choir in terms of saying this, but it's something that I encounter as a frequent misunderstanding, is that folks think that there's some kind of embedded color information in the original that can simply be retrieved through an algorithm. And of course, that's not true. There's no, existing color information in the original image. It can't simply be processed backwards. Even a lot of historians don't understand that. So all of the kind of color that you see on the right-hand side has been selected, through this AI program. And then it's subjectively decided. There's different versions that it proposes, and then you can, in post-production, change and alter the color in different sorts of ways. So essentially what we're seeing is something where the color has been pretty much subjectively applied, right? So there's lots of subjective choices being made in terms of color of clothing and really everything to do with the photograph. And I suppose from my perspective, these photographs in the context of when they were produced, they were essentially propaganda photographs. And as lantern slides, they were shown all across Ireland. They were shown all across Britain, both in terms of pro and anti-home rule campaigns in the 1880s. So they already sort of had this really interesting kind of flexible history as images, which were being, again, sort of shown for completely opposite sides of on the political spectrum. And so to kind of see them translated, and they're very distressing images really as well, because they're images of eviction. They're, this unhoming of people in these quite brutal and violent ways. And so I suppose to see it translated into these kind of candy colors, these pastel colors, for me was, I think, quite upsetting. And really, again, as I say, that's the kind of thing that got me thinking more deeply about colorization and being concerned about what it's performing and what it's doing to these kinds of historical artifacts. And that as well, I think, is exacerbated by the fact that increasingly these kinds of images become disattached from their originals, and they start circulating online and in other places. And so I've increasingly, for example, I teach hundreds of students in art history every year at UCD, and increasingly I'm starting to see colorized images creeping into my students' essays without any recognition or understanding that that's what they are, that there's been this kind of other level of contemporary intervention sort of imposed on the image. So that's another thing, I suppose, that's really motivated my concern over what's happening.
Have you seen these pictures circulating without it being acknowledged that they are colorized?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think I sent you that other image it should be the slide just before this, which was a really interesting example that came up in early March. Folks, again, if you're from Ireland, you probably recognize this image. This is the sort of famous image of Pearse's surrender at the GPO in 1916. Now, the reason why the photograph, which is on the left, the original, and the negative doesn't survive, by the way, we just have these various sorts of prints of it. And the reason why it's well known is because of the figure of Elizabeth Farrell, the nurse who's standing behind Pearse as he's surrendering. And in various iterations of this photograph, as it was published, around the time of its taking, her figure was erased out of it, right? So she's kind of doctored out of the photograph. And so this has been taken as quite a potent metaphor for the erasure of women during the revolution, etc. But so it's an image whose history and sort of fame and renown is tied to the fact that it was doctored in its own day. But what you see on the right-hand side is a photograph that appeared in the Irish Times. And it's a colorized version of that photograph. So another level of distortion has been put onto the image, but within the Irish Times, there was no acknowledgement that they had colorized this image. So it just appeared, it was an article to do with something else, but it just appeared as kind of a historical illustration, as if it was the original image. But again, all that we see here is a subjective layer of color which has been applied to it. So as I say, when you start to see these things kind of circulating even in mass media like the Irish Times, to me that's actually a really concerning issue.
Why do you think people do it?
I think people do it because it's fun, and I understand that element of it, and it's enjoyable. And to an extent, if people want to colorize their own family photographs, or they're doing it as kind of a hobby, there are things which, of course, aren't wrong with that. It can be sort of quite a playful intervention. My issue is when, again, this is happening increasingly to historical collections, and to what sort of subsequently that's doing to people's understanding of photographs as material objects. And I suppose that's really the piece that I've written for for your magazine, for Source for this month, really kind of tries to get to the heart of that question, is what does this do to people's understanding of the materiality of photographs and the complexity of photographic seeing and photographic production? Because colorization takes out all of those elements of photography, which are actually often quite central to understanding what it is. So sometimes those questions aren't relevant if it's being done in a personal capacity, but when we're talking about historical collections, I think those questions do matter.
There's an interesting essay by Philip Prodger that we were talking about, in which he talks about the history of colorization, and he talks about the tradition of hand coloring photographs, which would have been a contemporaneous activity in the early 19th century, or in the mid-19th century. Is that different from what you're talking about?
I think it is, because the motivation of what people are trying to do is quite distinct, and the discourse around it is very different than what you see kind of contemporary colorists in the 19th century trying to do. Because of course what people in the 19th century are doing are coloring their own photographs. They're coloring photographs of themselves. They're colorizing photographs that have been made in their own time. And that's not what's happening with contemporary colorization. And I just see so often in the kind of discourse around this type of historical colorization, these really fundamental misunderstandings of the relationship between color and truth and authenticity. And for me, that's just, it really kind of jars when you're talking about something that also has this kind of evidentiary quality, you know, attached to it as well. So I would see there being actually quite a distinct difference between what contemporary colorists are doing and what, you know, folks in the 19th century were doing. But what people in the 19th century were doing, hand tinting their photographs, is more similar to what, you know, if colorists today want to hand tint a photo of their granny, that's fine. You know, again, that's continuing on in this tradition of tinting. But altering historical documents and then making the argument that they're somehow more authentic or real on the basis of this colorization, that I don't agree with at all.
A lot of people who are sharing these images online talk about a kind of emotional engagement with the image, as if, you know, they can feel strongly about the person who's depicted in it in a way that they wouldn't be able to do if it was a monochromatic image. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really subjective view. It's one I kind of struggle with, to be honest, probably the most in terms of this conversation. Clearly, there are people who respond, you know, much more strongly to the notion of a colorized image. One of the projects, again, that, you know, I find the most difficult in some ways to think about is the Faces of Auschwitz project, which was a collaboration with the Auschwitz Museum. So it was sanctioned by the collections at Auschwitz to colorize the images of the victims of the Holocaust. Again, my problem with looking at those is that they do seem more real, they do seem more emotive, but again, the color is very, very subjectively applied. And I think that we have a problem if we accept the argument that we need to see the past in black and white to feel more about it. And if we're tying empathy, you know, to what is really this sort of, you know, fictive intervention on the historical artifact, you know, that's very disturbing to me as well, especially as somebody who works persistently on images of poverty.
So since I commissioned the piece, as we started talking about this, there have been a couple of other. I'm going to stop sharing this image now. But since we commissioned the piece, a couple of things have happened. You mentioned it before. There was somebody who had been manipulating images from the Khmer Rouge death camp. Could you describe what had happened there for anyone who missed that story?
Yeah, and I suppose that's why in some ways, because there was an Irish connection to that story, it got covered very widely in the Irish media, as the Irish media here is wont to do anytime there's an Irish angle on anything. But in any case, you know, this was an Irish-based photographer who works as a, you know, professional sort of digital colorist and does these kinds of, you know, he does the kind of the videos as well in terms of the animations. But and what's interesting is that he had done this series of articles for Vice magazine. And the Khmer Rouge wasn't actually the first one. There was an earlier one where he had done the same thing with a series of mugshots of 1920s women in Australia, which are part of the Police Museum in Sydney. It's a fairly well-known collection, but I think at that time people didn't quite pick up on it yet. And what he had done to both the 1920s images and these images from the Khmer Rouge from this S-21 camp was to colorize the images, but also then to superimpose smiles on the faces to change the expressions. And so obviously this caused a big outcry. It resulted in a formal letter from the Cambodian Arts Ministry decrying this and really almost intimating legal action that might be taken around this. Some of the issues, of course, were that the museum, the S21 museum, did not sanction this. They didn't have anything to do with this. Obviously, you know, the Cambodian genocide is so close, really, in time. They're descendants of the people who were in the photographs who got very upset with this. But what was interesting for me is that the outcry was really, I suppose, on the level of distortion through, you know, the expression. But really for the colorist himself, he really saw this on a continuum with colorization. And in a sense, I kind of agree with him. It is on a continuum with colorization, much more extreme, obviously, in terms of what's happening and what he's doing to the historical photograph. But equally, you know, what he was doing with the 1920s, the Australian women images, was also quite distressing, because again, these were women, you know, who were being photographed in coercive circumstances, you know, under very kind of difficult lives. And, you know, there's a lot of work done on that particular kind of photo collection. And so to change any aspect of that record, I think, is really problematic, to try and make it more palatable in some kind of strange way to a contemporary viewer.
So since then, I don't know if you can call it a community, but some of the people who colorize pictures have got together and produced a sort of a code of conduct. Could you describe what's in it? Yeah,
so this is, I suppose, a kind of something that's sort of self-generated amongst what you could consider a sort of a loose collective of folks who are professional colorists. And they've kind of put together this code of conduct. And really, it's in response, I think, to this Khmer Rouge controversy. It seems to come off the back of that specifically, where they're sort of signing up a pledge saying this is what they're doing and that they won't distort historical images, or they will, you know, reproduce the past to the best of their ability and these kind of things. And I understand what they're doing. Reading through it, though, they borrow strange language, like they borrow the Google motto of "Don't be evil," which I'm not sure if borrowing sort of a corporate motto is really the best tack to take in something like this. But in any case, that's an aside. But I still think that fundamentally, really, they don't sort of accept, or would argue, I'm sure, with me on this point about this manipulation that's happening to the historical photograph, and this idea that they're not actually capturing the past better as it was. That's not something that I can accept, I suppose, as a photo historian, but it's still kind of a basic fundamental tenet that they believe is part of what they're doing.
Do you have a feeling that you are, as it were, swimming against the tide here? Because obviously, especially for images that are circulated in social media, images have become so much more mutable. And if we're talking about you made reference to the kind of physicality of photographs, especially old photographs, when by the time they've become a JPEG on someone's Twitter feed, that distinction is all lost. And since people are still going to continue to circulate images on Twitter more than they are by handing around daguerreotypes, do you think there's anything can really be done to minimize the effect that you're complaining about?
Well, I hope so. You know, I suppose it's two things. One, also, I think that historians have been really quite kind of insouciant about how they deal with images. Folks who I kind of think ought to know better in terms of dealing, or also I think putting photographs on the same level as any other kind of archival document, really trying to understand it, you know, to a deep level, the context of how it was produced, who saw it, you know, how has it been circulated, what's its afterlife, all of those questions that, again, for, you know, folks who read your magazine are probably part and parcel of how they think about photographs. But for a lot of historians, they still treat them as illustrations. So I would hope that in some ways my intervention in this, on the one hand, might have an impact on historians. And if it does, you know, for me, that's actually really significant and important, because they're an important constituency who use these kinds of images. Whether it'll have impact on the wider public, I don't know, but I do hope that it'll make people perhaps just pause a moment before, or think a little bit further when they may see a colorized photograph and think about, well, what's happening here? Why am I having the response to it that I'm having? And any sort of aspect of that, I think, for people to approach photographs with more criticality is a good thing.
Great, thanks very much. So that was fascinating. And if you want to read more about Emily's thoughts and in further depth, then have a look at the piece in the magazine. Now, has Ori joined us? Let's have a look.
Yes, he's there, Richard.
Great. So if we could now speak to Ori Gersht, who has a portfolio in the magazine. Ori, if you could unmute yourself there.
Yeah, I'm on. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, just about.
Okay, can you hear me better?
Yes, I can hear you and I can see you. Excellent. So you've just dashed across town to get to your screen.
Yes, I was in Farnham actually.
Okay, okay. Which is where you teach?
Yeah.
Yes. So we've published a sort of mini retrospective of your work in this issue, and you were interviewed by Declan Long, who there was a very interesting conversation about your work. But I thought this evening, as a special treat, we would talk about your new work, which hasn't been published before, and we can even show one picture that hasn't been seen before. But maybe if you could start by telling us a little bit about how you started doing this work.
Okay, so I started this work when after I visited the consistorias in Vienna, where on the way out, I think it was after the Peter Bruegel exhibition, on the way out, when we went to the shop, saw this wall with all the postcards from the museum. And I took some pictures of this wall and created this panorama. And it occurred to me that actually this panorama is a reflection on how the museum would like to express itself to the public. And it's a kind of a meeting point between the tastemakers and the audience. And to an extent, I start to think actually, if I go museum after museum to the seminal museum, Western Museum, I can almost create a sort of a comprehensive narrative from a very particular prism of our history. And then I start to think more about this kind of the relationships that the museum has to the original work, and the fact that many of the works were taken out of the original context and then they were brought into the museum for various reasons. And I mean, some cases they were looted, some cases they were bought because, you know, people from power position were able, but the original were kind of taken away from their original context and all of a sudden presented in a place where, in an eclectic environment, where new order was imposed upon them. And when you come to a museum, there is always an impression of some sort of order or a narrative that was actually sometimes is utterly coincidental, and sometimes it creates an impression that has nothing to do with the original. So a new story is being created. Then I start to think about the moment where print became available and postcards were created. And one thing that kind of puzzling, I think, about postcard, that there is a they compromise the notion of space, so they're unifying the size of everything. But also they're kind of a point where actually visitors to the museum can come and take a trophy and leave the boundaries, the kind of the architectural confinement of the museum. So those images start to fly again into the world and moving into, and there is another kind of step in disorder, and a new order is being created. And I'm thinking very much about the time that we're living now, in time of the digital revolution, where these images are kind of popping everywhere on screens. They're becoming some sort of fragment of collective memories that are once again kind of disseminated everywhere. And in all my work, I'm very much interested in, and I constantly come to three particular moments. It's the 17th century where the scientific revolution took place, the 19th century in the industrial revolution, now the digital revolution. And I often look at them from the photographic prism. So the lenses were invented in the 17th century, and all of a sudden the lens become an extension to the human eye, and people can see, exceed the boundaries of photos available to the human body up to this point. And I think about it, moment of compression of space. And then the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, where the chemistry was invented and photography was able to create an illusion of stopping the linear passage of time. And this goes at the time where speed is becoming very much an issue with steam engines and production. And I'm thinking about the postcard as well, of kind of a mass mechanical reproduction. And now in the digital revolution, it's absolute collapse of time and space. And we're living in a place where there is no linearity and order, and all space all kind of almost kind of completely disintegrated. So this sort of relationship are very much at the core, the starting point.
Let me share the first image from the sequence. Has that appeared on screen now?
The resolution is not great.
Yeah.
I have.
There's a closer in image.
Shall I try to share a high resolution image? Do you want me to?
Well, I think it's not going to be much more high resolution on people's screens.
No, I can, because I think that what you have is, you know, you can't see. I can, if you give me a share, I'm pretty sure I can bring something that will be very good quality.
Okay.
Let me just open it. One second. One second, I'm just opening it. Yeah. I'm just opening a large file. I'm pretty sure that it will be pretty good. And so, yeah, have I got the permission to share?
Yeah, I've made you a co-host, and I've stopped sharing that. So that's it.
Okay, so share. Okay. And is this better?
Yep.
Okay.
So what do we see?
Okay, so this is the Metropolitan Museum, and I went to the Metropolitan. I bought every postcard that they had. This was before the corona, and I also bought the book from various museums. I kind of collected all possible postcards, and also the books that collect all what the museum defines as the highlight, the most important painting. And then in the studio, I built this wall, and I bended this metal as a kind of a replica of the shop at the Kunsthistorie and the Kunsthistories in Vienna. So it's a kind of almost a one-to-one. I had the images and I built the grid accordingly. And then I printed all the postcards. So I have a black line at the end. It's not part of the image. I printed the postcard again on glass. And then I kind of wanted to create something that will almost be like an earthquake, where this whole materiality of it is shattering and everything starts to disintegrate and integrate, almost a process of entropy or a tension between order and disorder. So this kind of regimented grid that I created and those metal cages try to keep everything in play, and then everything starts to kind of leak in and flow between, and start to create an image that is not, that, I mean, there is an act of destruction, but I also see it as a kind of an act of integration, as something as if all the images are in flux and becoming. So something that is a kind of in a transience from one narrative into another, or from one possibility into another. So I'll just say, for example, I'll just move through it. And it was very important as well that the process, I mean, the lens is playing a major role in this. So the events that I capture in terms of space are actual events that are happening in front of the cameras, and not kind of a computer manipulation. It's truly the disintegration of the glass. And I'm working on it in layers, so it's from bottom to top, so they're actually falling. So I create the full wall. Actually, this wall was created in 3 parts because it's so large. I create the wall, and all the glasses are in there. So when they fall, they actually fall on top of each other. But the time is not a linear time. So I capture the event because of the grid, everything is registered. So the events are multiple events, but they're happening. So space, it's a true reflection of space, but there is a compression of time.
So in each individual image that is put together to make the total complete picture, what is actually happening in each individual image?
So I capture it. So in the studio, I have a motion detected sensors that we have, and it's actually a rifle that is a kind of firing, and the cameras are responding. So the flashes are working in a delay. So it's capturing an event. I mean, I see this event as non-event. So as if the camera is capturing something that is happening in the fold of time. It's something that that without the camera doesn't really exist. So it's almost like events that that as if I'm kind of, it's a record of something that is transient, something that has no real presence in our kind of experience of the world. And together they are kind of creating one moment that that simultaneously I think is not something that it's kind of I mean, it's one thing that really interests me about photography, because photography have this capability almost to capture at times that is that for us is paradoxical. You know, I think often about the famous photograph of Robert Capa, where a bullet is penetrating a body and somebody is alive and dead simultaneously. Although this photograph was fabricated, but still the proposition of something of you know, it's almost like the live cat, the dead cat of Schrödinger, something that can be simultaneously in two states. And photography have the capability of doing this. And in a lot of my work, the reason I'm kind of always looking at this particular moment where something is simultaneously in two states, it's because photography has the capability almost to alter something that is unattainable. And for a second, it's there, and I capture something that doesn't really exist, but the camera still was there to witness. And
I was just connecting those two thoughts there. The images that you have here from the Metropolitan Museum.
yes.
If you transfer what your last thought about there being in two states, what does it say that you put these paintings into these two states? Can you describe what those two states are and what it says about those pictures?
Yeah, well, I call the series Becoming, and it's a, you know, I often think about processes of entropy of something. I mean, when you go to these places, we get a sense of almost of eternity, of something that is so permanent. And there is something, and particularly the state museums today, I mean, that start to kind of sell again collections. And the image that their museums are representing, that is a very particular narrative. I'm kind of trying to capture something that is almost in flux. So this whole thing is becoming something else. And this something else have its own internal beauty, where all these elements are totally disintegrating into something new. And they are permanently there, but also simultaneously they are in a state of disappearing. And this kind of a fragility of being in those two phases of something that is reflecting what we feel is so solid and give us a foundation to who we are, and at the same time, something that is evaporating and disappearing and becoming something completely else or almost alien, or redefining who we are, what we are.
Could you show us the next image that we, using your patent?
Okay, so for some reason I have a black line here that popped in that, anyway, I'll stop this and I'll share another one.
Do you spend a lot of time at this screen working on your images?
Yeah, so the first one that I showed took 2 months to put together. It's also the construction. I mean, it was really difficult during the Corona time because to get every, you know, just to bend the metal and to get all the accuracy of the grid, and then to print on the, I mean, this just took forever. But the actual assemblage of this image took about 2 months. And do you see, sorry, don't see the second image. I didn't do a share screen, so 1 second. Let me So share screen. So this is the second image, and these are the pieces of glass when they accumulated on the floor. So I collected all of them, and just a second. Okay, so you can see that they are, it's almost, I was thinking about it, almost a kind of you know, an archaeologist from the future looking at the present, but actually seeing, you know, relics of our past. It's a sort of, I mean, this idea of compressing time, of having this multiple vantage point in relation to a particular moment in history, it's something that I'm very much interested in. It's almost like I kind of felt when I was putting these together, because every piece was, it feels very precious, you know, it's kind of, there are thousands and thousands of them that's collecting on the floor. And the whole space become a kind of mess, and each one you find these pieces and they feel so precious. And the real, I think, I felt that there was a real kind of sensual experience of an archaeological relic, you know, kind of a discovery of an archaeological relic.
Did you find yourself arranging the bits?
So the starting point was just putting them all together, and then of course I start to kind of move things around and arrange. But it's not. It is an arrangement, but it's there is so far I was able, you know, to do. So it's a combination of some sort of randomness and then some deliberate desire to control or to make sure that the elements are, you know, kind of falling into a gratifying form. I'll go small again so you get. Yeah, so I wondered if shall we show now the new piece from the Rijksmuseum Museum in Amsterdam?
So your method up to this point, there's a sort of a sequence here that you, first of all, you have the collection of pictures, and this is the sort of the residue of the what happened to the images, and that you're looking at the wreckage.
Yeah,
and
which
this
is a kind of transformation of another image. So each moment creates its own memory or its own image, and the transformation kind of lead to another image. I mean, this kind of flux of endless. I think about, I mean, the processes. I think about entropy, about this kind of constant transition from order to disorder, kind of cooling down and things losing their shape, and the desperate desire to keep things in order. I mean, the photographic frame is very much like this. It's kind of containing these things and not letting the pieces go away or kind of disappear into some sort of chaos. And I kind of see it as a reflection onto my own life, you know, and part of being a photographer, of keeping my negatives together, of constantly fighting these natural processes of entropy, of my own disintegration. And then when you see the walls that I created with a very firm grid of the metal, there are little cages that are trying to impose a particular order, to resist what is actually happening when this earthquake take place and start to kind of pull apart. And these kind of two forces and the ways they are kind of acting upon each other, cultural desire, you come to the museum and you get a sense, a desire to keep everything together, to be in control, to almost claim a particular story. And with the total understanding that like the library in Alexandria, like anything, it's a stage in a flux that is keep on moving and kind of reforming into something else. So the work is very much about these things and kind of touching upon these moments that we feel so precious about. You know, I have to admit that in the process, I feel a little bit uncomfortable dealing with this. And at the same time, there is something that as it transforms, they kind of regain a particular beauty and richness that is becoming, you know, or reclaiming something absolutely new. So yeah, that's.
So in the last picture you're going to show us,
Yeah, do you want to share? Because let me just see if I have this one. I have it. I can show it actually. I'll stop share and I'll share again. I know where it is. Okay. 1 second, and I'm showing. Okay, so this is from the Reich Museum in Amsterdam, and I started. I kind of slightly changed the approach. So I took one image, and I actually blew it up, and then I broke it down to 49 postcard size sections, and each section is printed on glass. So it's a large image that is divided into a 7 by 7. Just last week, I started to think, why did I choose 7 by 7, which is a very, I mean, it's quite a significant number, but there was no particular reason for that. It was an absolute chance, but I need to kind of reflect and figure why, where did it come from. But anyway, and then, so the one image is broken already into a grid. So there are already initial fragmentation, and then each section is breaking in itself, and the whole thing is kind of moving. And I start to think about these almost as a tension that exists between matter and the image, as if the materiality of this thing is being peeled off and revealing something that is hidden, which has no physical presence. It's kind of almost a virtual, the image that is hiding behind, or the tension that exists between the physical existence of something and the image of itself. And so this sort of kind of tension of an eruption, almost like an earthquake that kind of peeling everything off. And then you enter into a place where, when there is an experience of an image, but which float in a absolute virtual space with no physical or
also this image is a vanitas, I suppose, is it?
It's one of the flowers. So I kind of took a selection. I started to look. I mean, in the 17th and 18th century, in the Reich Museum, it's slightly different from any other museum because there is a huge collection, original collection of Dutch art. Because when sort of the empire subsided, there was no real war, so a lot of the things were left there. There is a reference to particular individuals in the portrait, the names and the history and so forth. But it's so the flowers and the still life that were the collections in the museums are huge. Lots of them will never see the light. And I kind of try to collect a key painting by very well-known painters. And yes, they are all vanitas, so I'm kind of particularly focused on a very exuberant flower painting and still life painting at the moment.
You've chosen a picture which already has as its theme entropy.
Yeah, and in many of my flower work, there is this sort of relation. There is a celebration of beauty and also its decay, and I'm kind of there is something that reiterating this, and also I'm kind of referring to the past, but creating moments that were incomprehensible then, because pictures I create are so deeply rooted in technology, and even the fact that each moment was actually captured in camera, the fact that I can compress time in a way that was unattainable and incomprehensible to people in the 17th or 18th century, because our whole phenomenal notion of time, like talking on Zoom at the moment and getting a sense of real proximity, and the fact that we can experience time, or we can we can lift ourselves out of this sense of linearity, even when seeing a replay on television, a sport event. I mean, what I'm doing here, there is an absolute compression of many times into one, but the event is a one single event. I mean, this sort of relationship to, and that's part of what I'm kind of interested when I talk about a complete collapse of the notion of space and time. And in all my work, I'm always trying to look and examine this phenomena in relation to art history or to visual imageries that I feel kind of form the foundation for how I conceive images and create them.
Great. Thanks very much. We should leave a few minutes for people to ask questions. So thank you, Ori. That was a lightning tour, and it was lovely to be able to see in close to the image there. The format for asking questions is if anybody wants to ask a question, if you can either write a question in the chat, or if you can put up your hand through the magic of Zoom. And then we can ask people to chip in. I should say, just while we were talking there, in a way that John and I, my co-editor, were speaking about this issue of the magazine this afternoon. And the moment it comes back in the post, you suddenly start to discover connections between things that you hadn't noticed before. And of course, Richard Overton, who is the librarian at the Bodleian in Oxford, he has just published a book about the destruction of libraries, which has a wonderful parallel with what you've just been talking about. I suppose that's partly his responsibility as the sort of preservation of things in exactly the way you were talking about the feeling we get from museums. But let's see if there's anybody wants to ask us any questions. That whinnying is a hungry whippet in the background. I hope he doesn't interfere with with our conversation. So, Ori, how far are you through this work at the moment? Because you're working on it at the minute.
Yeah, and it's a long journey, so it will take some time, and like I said, it's very labor intensive. So at the moment, I'm working on those images from the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, and I'm working on a group of 6 flowers at the moment, and then some still life. I'm due to have an exhibition in New York, T&C Richardson Gallery in October. And so my focus is, it will be a chapter in this journey, because the numbers of works and the things that I would like to cover is quite substantial. I don't know. I would like to complete a few more of the Rijksmuseum, and I kind of, with the Metropolitan, there are a lot of iconic images. Some of the painters are very famous, but I would like to create the images that they don't have as distinctive identity. So we're not coming and say, this is Bruegel, there is something about them, about the experience of the event that is cast some sort of anonymity. So I'm working on this now. And then I may look at the consistorias, which was it's kind of the museum shops that actually triggered this whole process. I may create one of them if I have time for this show. And then I'll see. It's a trial and error process. I start to work on this series at the beginning of the Corona, so about a year ago. And technically, it was very challenging. So we did so many experiments at the studio. I have in the basement of my studio, I have a space, and I work with toughened glass, with circular toughened glass. I print on it in different ways. Figuring the trigger and figuring out to work. So it's only about 3 months ago that I came to some sort of methodology that I feel that is working well. And every time I create an image, it's bring new possibilities or questions, and so I don't know how the process will evolve. So I can't put like a endpoint to it. I just kind of, at the moment I'm working, I know that there is a show in October, and I start to have enough works for that, and I know what I would like, you know, what I'm kind of planning it till the end of July, where I have to conclude and start printing them.
So just to introduce our two different guests, Emily, you had a question there for Ori. So maybe if Emily, if you'd unmute yourself, you could ask Ori a question yourself.
Sure. Yes, it's really fascinating work, Ori. And my question actually was about, it seems obviously you're using primarily old master images from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I was wondering, in terms of your concept, you know, if you considered using modernist paintings, or is that for you, does that not work in the same way? Does it not transfer, you know, because modernist works as well as contemporary photography and other kinds of work obviously also features museum postcards, are reduced in the same kind of way. All of the logics that you're talking about obviously apply to artwork of all kinds, not just old masters. So I was just curious about that sort of, what led you to sort of focus on that specifically?
Okay, so first in the Metropolitan, I go to the 19th century. So there's you know, it's more or less to Van Gogh point. There are the Impressionists before, and the Romantics are in there, and the seminal museums that I mean, there are a few reasons for that, and I may move into modernism, but I'm interested in a past that seems removed to a point where it's almost feel timeless. And it's probably, it has to do with this kind of sense of eternity, you know, itself. When I go and look at a Leonardo, I feel that there is something very reassuring about something that was always there and will always be there. So this is one thing. And also, it kind of takes me to a particular moment in European history, because a lot of it predominantly is reflecting or relating to European history. And from that distance, and I get this sense when I walk in the National Gallery, you know, you look at work from Holland, from France, from Germany, from England, and you don't. It's removed enough not to think often about national identity. It's just become art history. There is something that is almost a kind of there is something that almost like a common denominator of some sort. So this is another reason. And I think that some of those seminal museums, so, you know, if I go to places like the Louvre and the Kunsthistorias and the Reich Museum, the foundation of the collection is up to around the 19th century. So the focus of these museums and the role they have in our in our culture, you know, I can move into the MoMA and places like this where it's much more modern, or the Tate, but I think that it's I still feel that what the National Gallery in England and the National Gallery in Washington, you know, these places, this seems to hold something that is almost kind of gluing, you know, the foundation of how, you know, kind of a Western culture perceive itself. I think it may change as well, though. So, you know, because it's, like I said, it's a sort of a progressive experiment. You know, things are happening in time, so they're informing one event inform the next.
If I could use a magic word there to apply to what you've just been talking about there, or you might say that it is a legacy, which brings us neatly back to the theme of the new issue. And it's as if we had meant it all the time to be tied up together like that. We have another question. We could take one more question, and then I'm going to have to feed this skinny dog. But Tanya, you had a question for Emily. Tanya, would you like to, this is Tanya from the Gallery of Photography. Tanya, would you like to ask Emily the question?
Do I have to ask it? Do I? Oh man. I was here happily eating my dinner, enjoying it very much. Thank you so much. And it's a really great discussion this evening. It was a quick, I've written it there really. What did I say? I said that, yes, it's the colorization. You know, we've been discussing this a lot in the gallery, where we're doing a big history of photography landmark exhibition in November onto the whole season of it. So it's very much in the front of our minds. And we just kind of are thinking that, well, I'm thinking that, is it always bad? I think the Old Ireland in colour did us all a disservice. It's very heavy-handed in the colour. So, but if you look at things like the Cannes Foundation pictures, they, you know, originally made in original colour, or you look at Sergei, what was his name? Sergei Prokudin, something or other, the guy from the First World War in Russia. Those pictures are authentic, if you like, but you know, from the various processes that they have, the autochrome or whatever, like they have a quality of them of their own, and I don't know quite how authentic they are. It's the same question, you know. So I just feel kind of, I feel a bit uneasy, kind of turning it away, turning colorization and deodify and all those things. I think it's a matter of degree rather than kind, and I just wonder whether you agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question. I suppose it kind of comes down to what the intent, for me, in some respects, of the colorization is. What is it trying to achieve? I do, in some ways, take issue with the idea that there's colorization that is more skillful than other forms of colorization, therefore it's superior or it's better. Because I think the same problems still exist, whether colorization is done badly or whether it's done well. And it's interesting because what I've seen in some of the kind of conversations is this attempt to sort of distinguish between the sort of professional colorist who takes more care and time and attention, supposedly, with the photographs. And I know that they do, as opposed to those which are just run through deodify, and everybody has these kind of, you know, monochrome sort of peach. Everyone's peach, turns out peach, using deodify in terms of their skin tone and these kinds of things.
No, I always think they look like corpses, overly made up corpses, but yes, yeah.
Yeah, if you look at enough of them, you spot it really quickly when something's colorized, you know, it's very easy to sort of notice. So yeah, I don't know if the question is about whether or not it's always wrong. Again, because I think when it comes to sort of personal photographs and things like that, like I wouldn't say that there's not necessarily anything sort of ethical.
I'm talking about the historical record though, you know.
Yeah. But in terms of, I guess I'm not sure, are you talking about photographs which were originally where color processes were being experimented with, like kind of autochromes, this kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking those Russian ones, for example, they were really remarkable. They were remarkable in that way that these now kind of badly colorized pictures are remarkable, but when you look at them you just go wow, you know, and yet they're done in this kind of three process whatever, you know, it's all very, if you like, authentic. So it's I'm also kind of just sort of troubled at the kind of trying to hold things to the way they are, the way they have been, and I think there is a possibility here. I agree, like most of the time it's done terribly, and the Khmer Rouge guy, you know, terrible. But there are things that we can do with these processes that are not just a matter of coloring your grandfather or something and feeling something closer. I think it raises all the questions about the kind of emotive side of photography, and the emotive side of historical photography is something that I think historians are very quick to try to downplay, you know, and to be all scientific about it, which is, you know, I think is necessary. But I think also then we also have to bear in mind that there is that real emotional pull for people, and if this works for that, I don't know. there.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, I guess, because I sort of come back to the fact that all the time when this kind of this sort of act of colorization is happening, you know, it is a fictive process. And if folks were more transparent about that aspect of it, that it is very subjective what they're doing. But again, that's not the way that the colorists tend to talk about the practice of what they're doing. It's couched in this term, and the emotional part of it I get completely, you know, and I understand, because even I look at colorized sometimes photographs and you have this sort of wow, you know, response to it. But I suppose it's this argument that what they're doing is somehow is creating a version of a historical evidence that's somehow more real. And that to me is really problematic. But I guess it's also sort of investing in photographs that sort of evidentiary quality as being its most important aspect, which I don't really think it is. I know it is for some people, but again, that's the part that I just think, oof, yeah, but a photograph is always such a partial snippet and fragment of reality. And colorization doesn't seem to want to accept that aspect of photography. So I guess that's for me where it becomes, you know, really problematic. And then as well, just because many of the photographs that we're talking about here are not kind of artistic interventions. You know, Mick O'Dea, for example, is an artist who's working with those, you know, lantern slides, those original 19th century lantern slides, and reconfiguring them in really interesting and provocative ways, you know, and making these kind of amazing canvases based on these sorts of images. But colorists are really trying to, what they think is improving history, not necessarily just dealing with the image, but actually improving history. And I don't think that's what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No. Thank you.
I do take your point. You know, I do think it is sort of on a continuum of different kinds of interventions into photography and color, which is also why I think photo historians ought to be talking about it more than they have done so far.
Right, indeed.
Great, thanks.
I see Alva is saying something here. Richard.
Yes, sorry, I interrupted you there.
Oh no, they are to everybody. Okay.
So, well, that brings us back to the comment on YouTube. How can they say anything when they know nothing? Which is a constant mystery. Thank you, everybody who's contributed to this evening's conversation. I hope you enjoy the new issue of the magazine, and I hope that this evening has given you a taste of some of the riches within this issue. Go out into the world and enjoy photography exhibitions and books, and see us again in a few months' time for the next issue of Source. But until then, thank you everybody for coming along, and thank you to our two guests, Ori and Emily. And we'll, with a round of applause for those, if people are inclined to do so. And we'll see you at the next Zoom talk, or maybe in real life. Thank you, and good evening.
Thanks. Bye.